be like growing up into all this shit. Well, I'll be in a state-led leader. I'm tempted to run it. I think that we could replenish it after Trump's gone, depending upon the state of the United States. If Vance doesn't suddenly try to become president and running in 2028 or 9 or whatever, right? Perish the thought. So sorry, I know I keep interjecting.
No,
I know you've got tons to say. Sorry. Because I'm passionate, because I'm going to be like growing up into all this shit. Well, I'll be in a state-led leader. I'm tempted to run for office because I look at this shit and I want to do something to save the UK, to try and. That's why I respect Macron, because at least he's friggin' making the statements that need to be said and the shit that everyone of any sense is thinking. That Europe, what the fuck are we doing? Excuse me, but like, yeah. Anyway, sorry, Michael. I'll shut up.
Well, again, this is my point where I'm like, liberalism is nice. Liberalism abides by the laws. Liberalism stops when the light turns yellow instead of going fast. But the reality is that the minute that you decide to follow the rules of the road when everyone else doesn't, is when you get rear-ended, when you get
right-wingers. No, it's
when you get
James
run off the road.
Lindsay. James Kerr Lindsay.
We're talking about Europe trying to follow laws that no one really seems to be interested in following. And, a basic, life lesson that I impart on most of my students is that reality is dictated by the most insane person in the room. And Trump has entered the room. And his foreign policy beyond Ukraine, beyond Europe. I mean, everything with, buying Greenland, making Canada the 51st state, turning Gaza into Mar-a-Lago 2.0. I mean, it almost seems like he is trying to throw whatever, at the wall and seeing what sticks, or just, making his opponents completely flabbergasted with, is he serious? Or does he mean this? And seeing what ends up happening. His proposal for Ukraine is just that.
So I started it yesterday. And I just got tired like 30 minutes in. But they're just having a conversation about different things that are going on in the world. But James Kerr Lindsay at the bottom here is like our favorite like foreign policy content creator.
There is no guarantee.
He specializes in like autonomous nations
the
and
agenda
stuff
for peace talks. And so, before we even think about what Europe wants or because as far as Trump's concerned, I mean, look, let's be perfectly honest here. Trump doesn't care what Europe thinks. And that is a reflection of the State Department, the Pentagon. Europe is supposed to just simply fall in line. All right, let's be honest here. Yeah. In the last couple of years, the European Union has become the financial appendage of NATO, and NATO has become the military extension of the United States.
Professor James Kerr Lindsay, though, at the bottom, he's like one of our like dream guests to have on.
Full stop. And if you find that to be problematic, well, too bad. I mean, that's just, I'm sorry. Okay, you might be an idealist from Latvia. Okay, but I hate to break it. I hate to break it to the Baltics, who were so happy last week that they just decided to like systemically cut themselves off from the from the Russian
energy grid. Yeah.
Grid. I hate to break it to the Baltics. Nobody cares. Nobody cares. All right, have fun with it. Okay, have at it. I mean, look, all power to you. I'm not pro or anti. I'm just like, you want to go. My point is this: Europe is basically talking about the codes of conduct in an arena now where it's all no holds barred. So, whether Europe needs to get its act together or whether Europe will develop a united voice, I don't think Europe will develop a united voice. I know that their leaders right now, Schultz has effectively said that he's even thinking of declaring emergency, not emergency powers, but what is it? A national, something like that, something in effect where, Germany needs to redouble its efforts in sending economic aid to Ukraine. Macron may very well say that he's going to pick up the slack where Trump leaves off. This is all fine and good, depending upon whether the European electorate wants to support this. And at the end of the day, the electorate in France and Germany and elsewhere are beginning to ask, why is Ukraine more important than the issues and the problems that we have at home? And this is being exacerbated by people like Orban, like Fico, when he is not dealing with his own internal problems in his own country, Vucic as well. This is one of those
He's on
issues
his
by
way out,
saying
though,
Ukraine
Vucic, I
is not
think.
our fight. It never should have been our fight. And if the EU officials continue to push for continued support for Ukraine at the expense of our own economy, it's going to continue to give more credence to the national populist parties like AfD, National Front, among others, that are basically banking on the current establishment to shoot themselves in the foot. When we look at Germany, I don't think anyone here is going, I don't think either the three of us are confident that AfD is going to win outright in an election.
I don't think it matters if
They will
Vucic is in the
get
EU. I think it matters, like, the point that he's making is that if these far-right parties continue to rise throughout Europe, it's going to be problematic, and Europe needs to get real and get with the picture and start basically figuring out what to do about it.
Votes that will necessitate, in my opinion, a CDU, SPD, heaven help us, a Green Party coalition, which will cobble together enough votes to keep AfD out. But it's going to be a very unpopular government in Germany, especially if they continue to push the agenda that, alles für Ukraine in that regard. And that is going to feed into skepticism. If nothing else, Trump is, and I'm not supporting this in any way, but Trump is effectively saying, look, Ukraine's it's a losing gambit, right? It's a losing investment. We tried, it didn't work, cut your losses, make a deal with Putin, do whatever business needs to be done. Let's get back on track here. Sanctions don't help. Embargoes don't help. And if Europe, you don't want to get involved in this, you can be a passive observer, because that I think is exactly what is happening here. The only thing, and I'll say this before I throw it back into the general discussion here, the one thing that I believe Trump's proposals may sabotage the entire thing is, if you remember from the Munich conference, it was already voiced that Trump has interest in acquiring at least 51% of Ukraine's mineral and raw materials.
I don't think he's sidelining. I think he's just pointing out that they're going to use it to sideline.
Trump style. We basically turn it into a business venture, a timeshare, in which case Ukraine will turn over much of its natural resources to American economic interests, right? They said Ukraine will enter America's economic sphere. If I were a Ukrainian and I'm the only American in this three-part conversation, I would be very, very wary about that, because it is not a partnership. It is absolutely asymmetrical interdependence in which Ukraine is effectively a ward of U.S. economic interests. And so Zelensky, knowing this, right, sees this proposal that was effectively put in front of him, like any normal, rational leader of any state would do, hesitated and will most likely not sign on this. So the only thing that I could see that might give Ukraine some kind of breathing room is that his hesitancy to sign on to Trump's idea for a ceasefire in Ukraine gives the EU an advantage. It gives them an opening to act as an alternative arbiter. But in order for that to work, the EU as a united organization must, and I cannot underscore this enough, must offer a plausible alternative ceasefire agreement that counters anything that Trump offers and ultimately gets Trump to either walk away and say it's your business to deal with, or gets him to, in some way, shape, or form, compromise.
So, yeah, let's be specific then, because I want to position this in some concrete proposals or options here. I've always been not opposed to eventual Ukrainian membership of NATO, but I've always been opposed to speed tracking it, fast tracking it, because it's not ready. The country is huge. Corruption is a problem. It's gotten better. The economy is, well, prior to the war, it was improving, but it's not on the same level, and therefore the ability for, well, the option capacity for interoperability is limited. It's the same. It's not just Ukraine. It's Moldova. It's any Eastern European or less developed state that would somehow then have to be working on a similar level to Western Europe. But it's the same with the European Union.
Do you mean NATO or the European Union there, Piotr?
Say again?
Did you mean NATO or the European Union?
Well, both, actually. Ukraine is not ready for either.
NATO's a much lower bar.
Really?
The European Union, I completely agree. European Union, there are very, very sound reasons for not taking in countries before they're ready, because Europe is so all-encompassing across all sorts of laws. It's about sort of making sure that investments will be safe. It's about making sure that, you know, products, foodstuffs, all of that is safe for consumers. So European Union, I've always argued there should be no fast track process. NATO's a bit of a different beast.
Well, explain to me how you think Ukraine could be integrated into NATO in an effective way without compromising more European security and defense.
Well, I mean, listen, the integration of countries into NATO is about military interoperability, essentially, and making sure there are some other issues. So, for example, when Montenegro joined, there were real concerns about leaking into Russian intelligence services. That was the main thing. But let's not forget that many countries which are a long way off from EU membership were readily taken into NATO. You have Albania in there, you have North Macedonia. These past few years, Ukraine has been armed with NATO weaponry. It's been trained by NATO forces. I think that its integration into NATO from that perspective would actually be much, much simpler than it would have been 3 or 4 years ago. And because you're not having to deal with things like, you know, and I just say it because I always love saying it, phytosanitary certification and all sorts of things to do with sort of, you know, what Ukraine is doing in terms of rule of law and corruption and things like that. NATO doesn't terribly care about these sorts of issues in the way that the European Union does. I mean, I'm not saying it's completely unimportant, but I think actually taking in Ukraine into NATO would be a much more straightforward than, I'm not saying it's completely straightforward. There are a lot of issues, and obviously there's the big political issue about Article 5 and where do you draw the line on that? Is it the, you know, anyway, those are things that need to be sorted out at the political level. But I think it could. Is
Jack going to join later? Yes.
To NATO. I mean, the other alternative, but as I said, I think is really troubling, and I think that European leaders won't want to go down this path, is the EU dimension to this, and saying, well, could fast track, because of course EU membership now comes since Lisbon with a mutual defence element. I mean, this is often forgotten that actually outside of NATO, just within the European Union, there's a commitment to mutual defence. But I don't think that European leaders are going to go down that path.
Well, let's be very specific then. As part of any country that seeks to join NATO, there is the Membership Action Plan, or MAP, and there have been, you know, dozen or so plus countries that have joined between now and the end of the Cold War, and it's, you know, the process is very varied depending upon the member state in question. Finland and Sweden were largely immediate because their militaries are highly advanced. They're already quite integrated anyway. Bosnia has been doing this for the better part of a decade, since 2006-7, right? So, yes, I will grant you, James, that Ukraine's modernization of its military since 2014, especially, has been remarkable. We saw just how much it's changed from their operations in Kursk, not the operations themselves necessarily, but more the way that they've administered the area that they've since claimed from the Russians, right? And I was talking to Chris Cappy of Task and Purpose about this. So there is a modernization in both operations, but also mentality of troops, in terms of it's not about how many bodies you fling at the enemy. It's about restraint of casualty and losses. But okay, so that's possible. The issue with greater integration in NATO is obviously that's a deeper trigger for Moscow. the framing I've always had was that Ukraine would maybe have deeper integration with Europe and the EU because that's an economic bloc, and therefore that's more acceptable to the Russians than NATO. Obviously, this has all changed in the past 3 years, but there's also one fundamental act, which is that NATO doesn't allow countries that are partially occupied. So one argues Putin did this deliberately to prevent that eventual ascension into NATO. But it's even further than that, because whilst he fully controls Luhansk and Donetsk, Zaporizhia is what, 60%, and Kherson is like 75% control. So like, I think I go back to what Michael said, which is sort of before we talk about the existential crisis and inaction of Europe.
Oh, the noise,
Europe, we need to have a clear idea
of
some
capturing
kind of
desktop
plan.
audio.
I don't think there's ever going to be
even though the game is muted, somehow that
ceasefire,
the landing and takeoff sequence comes through.
But I am veering towards this sort of, if you want to call it frozen conflict, but some kind of DMZ, and then on the Western side, maybe it's done by, maybe Putin gives back one of the oblasts if he gets back Kursk, or he gives back both oblasts if Ukraine doesn't join both supranational organizations or alliances, right? There's so many different sort of ways this could go, scenarios that you know, one detail being slightly different to the other. But for me, I feel that Ukraine is going to have to accept Luhansk and Donetsk are gone. Zaporizhia and Kherson, it's not as clear. And then the complicated aspect of who it joins in terms of the alliances or blocks, in what way, but also who administers that DMZ or line of contact. Because right now we have, 90,000 troops in Britain. That's not enough. France, they have, activities in the rest of the world. They like to try to, project power. Germany is not there, frankly. The Poles, I guess, the Baltics, not enough population. So like there's a lot of unknowns here that really need to be ironed out. And while we can talk about it at a very grand strategic level of this is what it does, when you actually get down to the nuts and bolts of it, it's really quite difficult to see what details would be agreed on. I don't know if Michael, James, you have any thoughts on that, but that's because I don't know. It's really hard to distinguish, but I just don't see Ukraine being to go for maximalist of Putin.
Well, I know that one of the stipulations that Trump, the so-called Trump plan for a ceasefire in Ukraine, and this was leaked through Telegram a couple of weeks ago. Take it however it is, it's leaked through Telegram, so just take that with as much, grain of salt as you want. But Ukraine's NATO ship is off the table. Right? Ukraine's NATO partnership, membership in NATO is abolished, which is a major issue that Russia had wanted.
Not even in a looser format?
No.
Partnership for peace. They're both Russia and Ukraine are still part of partnerships for peace of NATO, right?
The parting gifts. All right, the parting gifts. I guess the consolation gift is that Ukraine's membership in the European Union would be envisioned as early as 2030. So we're talking about a fast-track membership, which, again, fast-track membership means one thing. James is absolutely right when it comes to the longevity of how long it takes to integrate some countries into the EU. And if Ukraine gets in by 2030, then that means that the EU has taken the rest of the Balkans in, because they are not going to let Ukraine go in before Serbia, North Macedonia, Albania, and all the others. So that is one thing. However, another element of this Trump plan would be that Ukraine would effectively fall under the economic and military guarantee of the United States. So instead of NATO membership, the United States would militarily support Ukraine, provide economic incentives, which goes into effectively its acquisition of most of its raw materials that are not part of the 5 oblasts that would go to Russia. It doesn't seem like a deal that any Ukrainian official would want to sign on unless they realize that this is the best deal that they're ever going to get, or run the risk of being a frozen conflict. Which, if we talk about frozen conflicts, I mean, at the diplomatic, at the official level, nobody likes frozen conflicts. in reality, behind the scenes, frozen conflicts are convenient because it delays coming to some kind of final agreement. It runs the clock out, and it gives either side the opportunity to wait until a more fortuitous future. Kosovo was a frozen conflict. Eastern Ukraine from 2014 to 2021 was a frozen conflict. Many of these disputed territories are frozen conflicts, right, in which sides are just simply waiting for a better fortune, a better opportunity, a better leg up at the negotiating table. If Ukraine if Kiev is able to get some kind
Willing to bet
of
they let Ukraine in before
ceasefire,
Serbia. They might.
and this is part of the Trump plan also, Ukraine is not required to recognize the loss of its eastern territories to Russia. Right, they are under no obligation, just like Serbia is under really no obligation to recognize Kosovo. Georgia is under no obligation to recognize Abkhazia, South Ossetia. It sort of settles things where they are at the military fault lines and leaves things for some kind of down the road plebiscite in the next 10 to 20 years, which in diplomatic way is saying I abrogate myself of any additional responsibility. I have achieved step one in conflict resolution, and that is stopping the fighting, stopping the killing. And that's enough. If we can get all sides to stop the actual violence, that's enough, at least for now. And then we deal, conflict management may at some point become conflict resolution, but that's not for, a down the road scenario.
James, do you want to go? Because I spoke.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we do have these models of these frozen conflicts. They're not great, but countries can live with them. Obviously we have Transnistria in the case of Moldova. We have South Ossetia and Abkhazia in the case of Georgia. So it could very well be that, as Michael says, I mean, you can get to a situation where Ukraine wouldn't be, or anyone else for that matter, formally required to recognize the loss of these territories. I mean, it could be used to stop the fighting, but then you are still left with a whole range of other issues. Do you reward Russia with reopening trade and lifting sanctions for simply having a ceasefire? And I think that there will be a lot of distaste at that idea.
Yeah, I was also thinking like
effectively
frozen conflict.
Russia, I mean,
what? No.
Google and Apple will not change the map to indicate that this is Russian territory. I mean, there's formulations they can do. They can just draw a line on the map and have it sort of semi-dotted to show that it's not, a formal state border, but some sort of boundary or whatever. So, those are ways that you can actually say. And I think Europe would continue to take that position. But there are a lot of other decisions that will have to be made. And I think the Ukrainians will be worried that longer term that will just get watered down, that pragmatism will creep in. I mean, Russia's never really paid a particularly heavy price for South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Transnistria, and this is part of the complaint, that maybe because it didn't face a particularly significant pushback on those issues, that it felt emboldened to do what it did in Ukraine. So I think there will have to be a lot of questions asked, and it's a far more complex process and a far more complex agreement than I think many people might realize, because there will be all these other elements that will have to go with it. And Russia might well just say, well, look, we want X, Y, and Z. We do want a lifting of sanctions in these areas. But then you're removing leverage that Europeans could be placing on a future Russian regime in order to resolve this territorial dispute and potentially return the territory back to Ukraine, albeit with maybe some sort of high degree of autonomy, or maybe even a federal system. These are all things that would have to be discussed later on. But I think there will be a sort of sense, if you draw a line now and say, right, okay, this is a ceasefire, it's not going to be recognized. There are a whole bunch of other things that will have to be really, really thought about, on what do you lift and how and when.
Well, this is a cheery Sunday afternoon, everybody. I don't really have much more to say. I think that the reality is quite well. Okay,
Yeah, the
I'll
Euro
put it this
Army
way.
bit was
I
like
think
the
that
first
the
30 minutes
main
that we watched yesterday.
caveat to all of the people who are saying that Trump is meeting Putin in Saudi Arabia and the time has come for a deal and Europe is out, Ukraine is out in terms of inclusion in the talks. Well, okay, guys, yeah, that's all terrible. Very, very astute of you, but the talks are beginning. That's not confirmation of anything. So that's my point, which is people are pro-Trumpers, pro-Putinists, or just people who are anti-Ukraine and grifters on the internet are making all these provocative emphases of how useless the West is, how Russia has won, all this. But they are missing the point or the longer-term view that this is not a guarantee of anything at all. If the talks collapse, which is still a very big possibility, yes, of course, Trump respects Putin or he doesn't want to have Ukraine as a headache because he wants to focus on China or whatever some other arguments could be. It's still not a guarantee. These are two very unpredictable guys with huge egos. And if Trump doesn't feel satisfied with what Putin is offering him or that he thinks Putin is not offering him anything at all, he will back out. And we could be back to square one where US comes even more, riding on the tank with the eagle flying behind, sunset, sunglasses, big cigar, kind of chat GBT image being created, right? Of Trump coming to support Ukraine even more. I don't particularly think the scenario is likely, but it is still one that could happen because this is Putin. And yeah, that's why I'm not holding out on anything yet until we see some kind of actual written piece of paper, some deliverables actually through saying, right, I had a really good talk with Putin. It was the best talk ever. We loved each other. I'm trying to, moonlight as Trump. Until I see something like that, I'm going to remain somewhat reserved in making too many sort of predictions because I just don't think it's over yet, if that makes sense. Michael, I don't know, James, maybe.
I would say, again, this 90-minute conversation is held under lock and key. At this point, I would pay good money to get the transcript of that conversation. I would pay serious good money because all we're getting from this conversation on Trump's side, right, is exactly as you said. We had a great talk. It was wonderful. We see eye to eye. He wants peace. I want peace. War is not good. I think we can, hash out an agreement. The Kremlin side, this is coming from both the Kremlin and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Putin wanting peace, how laughable.
Very, very, very much.
He wants
very
control.
Much wait and see what is going on. And that is all that we've had is a conversation. And in Russia's defense, I would have to say about this, right? One of the things that they have said, Putin and Lavrov, what they have said for the past 3 to 5 years, is that coming to an agreement with the West does not mean a guaranteed peace, because written agreements have frequently been ignored. They have been discarded. This is one of the big reasons for them taking action in Ukraine 3 years ago. They had the Minsk Accords, which according to Putin, Lavrov, Peskov, others, a written agreement on moving forward as far as Ukraine's sovereignty is concerned, in which the Minsk agreements recognize the Donbass as an integral part of Ukraine's territory, an agreement between the government in Kiev with local authorities within Donetsk and Lugansk for local elections, which would pave the way for some form of territorial autonomy. Once this happened, Russian forces would pull out, Ukrainian security forces would move into the border with Russia, problem solved. According to the Russian narrative, this was never implemented, and evidence now shows that Merkel, Sarkozy,
Is he
among others,
Axios guy
were
for the
basically
transcript? Does he
telling
got it?
Poroshenko at the time, don't implement it, just ignore it, run the clock out while we arm you, and you can eventually take the territory back. In the same way that Azerbaijan took back Nagorno-Karabakh, Croatia took back Serbia and Krajina. No problem, no minority, no issue whatsoever. So from Russia's standpoint, even reaching an agreement with the West still comes with a number of caveats, which may mean that Russia might believe Trump more than others because Trump is somewhat of an outlier, right? Trump is willing to he's willing to sacrifice countries. He's willing to sacrifice the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of countries for the greater thing, right? And if you want to play, the role of great power politics, a la, Otto von Bismarck in the 19th century, then so be it. I mean, it's very easy. It is very, very easy to do. But I do have to say, and I think that I can't speak, for James here, but I think he would agree with me that there's a very high probability that these talks will break down, that an agreement will ultimately be held up by Ukraine's military security, its future in NATO. Putin wants complete neutrality as far as Ukraine is concerned. I don't know what the rest of NATO will say to that. We've talked about this notion of European unity. There are those within NATO's European alliance, like the French and the Germans and the Slovaks and the Hungarians, that would say whatever is necessary. Poland, different story. Baltics, different story. And yes, they're small, but different story.
Don't call Poland
Finland,
small.
Sweden, different story. Romania, different story. We may end up seeing fractions results within the NATO alliance between the hardliners that want to continue to arm Ukraine for the sake of security and the moderates that say, at the end of the day, Ukraine is exactly what its name is, a borderland. And NATO's internal security has been preserved. Sweden and Finland have joined. The north-south axis between NATO to the west and Russia to the east has been defended. And small countries have to pay the price. And it's not like Ukraine isn't the first country to be thrown under the bus. Multiple countries have been thrown under the bus. Multiple societies, multiple nations have been thrown under the bus for the sake of collective peace and security, peace in our time in that regard. And, well before Chamberlain, waved that paper in front of the cameras.
Yeah, I think so. To sort of transition to you, James, then, my scenario I see is somewhat realistic, but a medium ground is Ukraine accepts that it's lost that territory, and the line is administered by NATO forces. That's the compromise. If Ukraine gives up the territory that is, under Russian control, Ukraine is able to have NATO forces in its territory as the defense line, as the defense entity in their territory. They are given greater access to the EU, maybe not NATO. I know what we talked about, one being easier than the other, or more preferable at the moment because of the change in interoperability and stuff. Ukraine is invested by the Europeans, and the US is they largely are disengaged. Maybe they provide some kind of overarching engagement via NATO, but that's about it, right? I can't see any other real medium. But a peace deal is never settled. I don't see a peace deal. I see a armistice and a heavy securitization of Ukraine along whatever the new line of contact is. And I see Russia likely violating the armistice at some point using some kind of, 2014 Little Green Men, quite a clever sort of, asymmetrical, gray zoned approach to conflict. Does that sound to you like a reasonable scenario, or you think it's going to be more extreme than that? And Ukraine ultimately suffers even more balkanizes or something.
I mean, look, the other thing so I'll sidestep it because I think I think at this stage, we're focusing maybe a little bit too much on outcome. and rather less than we should on process. Because I think the real worry that I would have is that this could very, very quickly escalate into a negotiation between the United States and Europe, rather than a negotiation between the United States and Russia. I think, and I'd say it's, Trump is lazy, very, very lazy, intellectually lazy and lazy. He wants to just, well, no,
right.
I mean, that's just the
No,
reality.
it's true. It's true.
You know,
What are these pyramids?
he's, you know, and this was the charge that was always leveled against George Bush, younger George W. Bush. Is
George
that,
Bush looks like an intellectual now.
well, precisely. That, you know, his nickname was Incurious George. And, you know, one of the things that they've said is you've got to have curiosity for that job. You want to know, Trump isn't interested. What worries me is that Putin is, and in this situation will be a very skilled negotiator. He'll have very clear ideas. We don't know what was said in the conversation between Putin and Trump in their 90-minute chat. Did Trump make commitments then that Putin will come back?
James
and say,
Carlindsey
"Well,
is
you
the
promised me this,"
smart one here.
in a way that Trump doesn't actually really understand what he was proposing when he had that conversation. He just spitballed stuff, as the Americans would say. And then Trump feels that somehow, in order to just get the deal and open up the opportunities, and if Putin is saying, and I know you want those access to those rare earth minerals, Ukraine's got a lot of it. We've got a lot more. And if you want to get us out of the orbit of China, well, you know, these are the sorts of things. I think that then, is it the case that Trump would say, rather than have this dispute with the Russians, who I think